The first time Patrick J. Adams stepped onto the set of Suits, he thought he was stepping into a dream. Lights, cameras, the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the studio, the kind of environment that whispered promise and possibility. But what no one tells you about the glittering world of television is that behind the polished suits and sharp lines, there's a hidden world. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. A world of unspoken rules, subtle manipulations, and pressures that push even the most composed actors to their limits. And for Patrick, what he encountered on that set wasn't just a challenge of acting. It was something far more personal, something that would stay with him for years until now. Imagine being young, ambitious, and talented, knowing you've landed a role that could define your career. You walk onto the set, excited, nervous, ready to give your best. Everyone seems friendly. Everyone seems professional. And then something shifts, something you don't see coming. The camaraderie starts to feel forced. The joke's a little too sharp. And the boundaries? Suddenly, they start to blur. Patrick knew the world of acting wasn't easy. He knew there were long hours, demanding directors, and the constant pressure to deliver. He had read about toxic sets, about whispered rumors of manipulations behind closed doors, about actors and actresses being pushed beyond what they thought was acceptable. But he never expected it to touch him in such a personal, invasive way. He never expected that someone he worked with, someone he trusted, would force him into situations that were uncomfortable, that went beyond acting. You might be thinking, this is just another Hollywood rumor. Big deal. But the reality is more shocking than most people can imagine. Because this wasn't just a fleeting, uncomfortable moment. It wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was something that shook Patrick at his core, forced him to question himself, his choices, and his path forward. And for years, he kept it silent. Why? Because in Hollywood, speaking out can mean career suicide. Because the industry protects its own. And because Patrick wanted to believe that perhaps he had misread the signals, that maybe he was overreacting. But as time went on, it became clear that this wasn't something he could ignore. It wasn't something he could simply chalk up to youthful naivety or the pressures of the job. The moment had consequences, emotional, professional, and personal. Every interaction on set after that felt like walking on a tightrope. Every smile, every casual conversation, every scene became a minefield of tension and uncertainty. Patrick's story isn't just about what happened on a set in Toronto. It's about the larger realities of the entertainment industry. It's about power dynamics, about how ambition can be weaponized, about how silence can become both a shield and a prison. And it's about the courage it takes to finally break that silence, to speak up, to reveal the truth, no matter the personal cost. He remembers the first time he tried to tell someone. Not a journalist, not a fan, not a publicist. Just a friend, someone he trusted outside the industry. He recounted the events, carefully choosing his words, hoping for validation, for understanding. The reaction was not what he expected. Some shrugged it off. Others urged him to forget it, to move on, to focus on his career. Because in the world of television, image is everything. Your story can be twisted, misrepresented, weaponized. And so, Patrick stayed quiet. But now, after years of reflection, after watching the industry grapple publicly with issues of consent, harassment, and abuse, Patrick has decided it's time. Time to tell his story. Time to peel back the curtain and let the world see what really happened on the set of Suits. And it's more than just the story of one man. It's a story that resonates with countless others in Hollywood who've had to navigate similar experiences in silence. What Patrick reveals isn't just shocking because of what was done to him. It's shocking because of how calculated, how subtle, and how manipulative it all was. It's shocking because it happened in an environment designed to entertain, to charm, to create illusions of perfection. It's shocking because it reminds us that behind every smiling face, behind every witty line, behind every perfectly tailored suit, there can be a hidden struggle. A hidden battle that no one sees until someone finally tells the truth. And here's the kicker. Patrick's revelations aren't just about discomfort or personal invasion. They shed light on a broader truth about Hollywood culture, about how ambition, talent, and charm can be manipulated, about how those who hold power often wield it in ways that are invisible to the public eye, yet devastating to those caught in their orbit. About how silence, for so long, is the currency that protects the industry's golden image. As we dive into this story, remember one thing. This isn't just about gossip. This isn't just about drama. This is a story about courage, about vulnerability, about the high stakes of honesty in an industry that often rewards silence. And it begins with a day on set that Patrick will never forget. The moment when lines were crossed, when boundaries were tested, when the game of ambition turned into a personal battle. You might be wondering, what exactly happened? How could someone force themselves on him beyond acting? How did Patrick respond? Did he speak out immediately, or did he swallow his fear and push through? And most importantly, what does this tell us about the hidden culture of shows like Suits, about the people we admire, and about the lines we assume will never be crossed? All of these questions will be answered, piece by piece, as we go deeper into Patrick's account. But before we get there, it's important to set the stage, to understand the pressures, the personalities, and the environment that made such an incident possible. To understand that this wasn't just about one person. It was about a system, a culture, and the invisible rules that govern it. And so, the story begins not with confrontation, not with accusation, but with the illusion of normalcy. The early days on set, the excitement of a new role, the thrill of working with a talented cast. Because what makes Patrick's revelation so powerful is the contrast between the on-screen glamour and the off-screen reality. Between the scripted smiles and the unscripted tension. Between the world everyone saw and the world Patrick experienced. Have you ever wondered what it's really like to step onto a television set for the first time? Not the red carpet glamour, not the glossy magazine shots, but the real, unfiltered experience behind the cameras? For Patrick J. Adams, that first day on the set of Suits was supposed to be a dream come true. A young actor, ambitious and hungry for success. He walked into the studio expecting creativity, collaboration, and a chance to shine. What he found instead was a complex maze of hidden rules, subtle manipulations, and unspoken power dynamics that would shape his entire experience on the show. At first, everything seemed perfect. The cast was charming, the crew welcoming, and the energy on set electric. Patrick remembers thinking, this is it. This is the career I've been waiting for. But even in that early glow of excitement, there were subtle signals he couldn't ignore. A glance here, a comment there. Tiny things that hinted at a deeper tension beneath the polished exterior. It was a world where everyone wore masks, a place where what you saw on camera was only half the story. Patrick's days began early and ended late. The schedule was relentless. Long hours memorizing lines, multiple takes, wardrobe changes, and constant adjustments to fit the high standards of the producers and directors. It was exhausting, but he didn't mind. He had prepared for this. He had dreamed of this. But what he hadn't prepared for were the layers of social navigation, the unspoken games of favoritism and influence, and the pressure to perform not just as an actor, but as a person who fit the hidden mold of what the show expected. Every set has a hierarchy, and Patrick quickly learned that understanding it was as important as understanding your lines. There were the lead actors, the producers, the directors, the writers, and then the rest of the crew. Each layer carried its own influence, and navigating them required a mix of charm, tact, and intuition. Patrick, being naturally friendly and approachable, tried to adapt, but he soon realized that in Hollywood, charm can be as dangerous as it is useful. People watch you, measure you, and sometimes manipulate you without you ever noticing. The first scene Patrick filmed was deceptively simple. On paper, it was a routine exchange, a showcase for his character's wit and intelligence. But on set, the dynamics were different. The cameras, lights, and crew were one thing, but the interpersonal pressures were another. He noticed subtle power plays from other actors, moments of tension masked by smiles, and interactions that hinted at underlying competition. At first, he tried to ignore it, attributing it to the natural stress of shooting a major television series. But as days turned into weeks, the patterns became impossible to miss. It wasn't just the workload that was overwhelming. It was the constant need to perform socially as well as professionally. Every joke, every conversation, every glance had a weight. Patrick had to be careful, not just about what he said, but how he said it, and even how he looked while saying it. There were unwritten rules, subtle expectations that weren't in any script. For instance, appearing too confident could be seen as arrogance. Being too reserved could be interpreted as disinterest. There was a narrow line to walk, and missteps had consequences. Whether that meant being sidelined from key scenes, losing favor with directors, or worse, becoming the subject of whispers in the hallways. One of the most disorienting aspects for Patrick was how quickly the atmosphere could change. One moment, everyone was laughing, sharing stories, building camaraderie. The next, a glance from the wrong person, an offhand comment, and the air could shift to icy tension. Patrick began to understand that the masks people wore weren't just for the camera. They were worn all the time, for protection, for strategy, for survival. And while some masks were harmless, others hid intentions that could complicate or even end careers. Patrick also noticed the way certain people used charm and charisma as weapons. They would draw you in, make you feel part of the inner circle, and then subtly manipulate your choices, your reactions, your perceptions. It was exhausting to stay alert constantly, to maintain a balance between being genuine and being strategically careful. And yet, Patrick adapted. He learned to read microexpressions, to sense tension before it became conflict, and to navigate conversations in ways that minimized risk while keeping him visible and valued as an actor. But amid this complex social dance, something more personal was beginning to emerge. Patrick started noticing interactions that made him uncomfortable in ways that were difficult to articulate. Subtle advances, moments that crossed professional boundaries, and the feeling that some people were testing how far he would go to accommodate or comply. At first, he questioned himself. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe he was overreacting. After all, Hollywood is a world of flirtation and play, right? But the feelings of discomfort persisted, escalating in intensity and frequency. It was during a particularly long day of shooting that Patrick experienced the first incident that would later define his silence. He was on set, focused on delivering his lines perfectly, when someone approached him under the guise of casual conversation. The tone was friendly, the setting public, yet the words carried an unmistakable pressure. Patrick felt a sudden and unwelcome intensity, a push that went beyond professional interaction. At that moment, the lines between acting and personal intrusion blurred, leaving him unsure of how to respond without jeopardizing his role or drawing unwanted attention. Patrick's instinct was to protect himself silently. He smiled, nodded, and tried to redirect the conversation, but inside, a storm of emotions brewed. Confusion, anger, anxiety, fear. How could someone leverage their position, their charm, to force such a personal engagement? And more importantly, what could he do? There were cameras, producers, crew members all around. Speaking out in the moment could have derailed his career. Staying silent felt like a slow suffocation. As days turned into weeks, Patrick realized this was not a one-time incident. It became a recurring theme, a pattern of pushing boundaries, testing limits, and blurring the line between acting and personal intrusion. And while the script demanded emotional intensity, what he was being asked to endure off-camera went far beyond his professional obligations. Every scene, every take, every interaction carried a weight that was invisible to the audience but felt heavy in his chest. Patrick's story is a reminder that television, no matter how glamorous it appears, has hidden pressures that most viewers never consider. The cameras capture the performance, the storyline, the polished version of reality. What they don't capture is the tension, the subtle manipulations, the ways in which ambition, charm, and control intersect in the hidden world behind the scenes. And for Patrick, this hidden world wasn't just stressful. It was invasive, personal, and emotionally taxing. There were moments of relief, moments of laughter, moments where the camaraderie felt genuine and the work felt rewarding. But they were always punctuated by unease, by the knowledge that at any moment, boundaries could be tested, personal space could be invaded, and professional pressures could become personal threats. Patrick had to learn to navigate this treacherous terrain, to perform not only as an actor but as a diplomat, a negotiator, and sometimes a protector of his own emotional safety. The glamour mask of Suits was dazzling. The costumes, the sets, the witty dialogue. All of it contributed to the illusion of perfection. But behind that mask lay a reality that was anything but perfect. It was a world of contradictions, laughter mixed with tension, friendliness mixed with manipulation, opportunity mixed with vulnerability. And for Patrick, the challenge was not just to perform his role convincingly on camera, but to survive the emotional and social intricacies that the cameras would never capture. So what does this teach us about the hidden reality of Hollywood? That even the most polished productions have layers of complexity that aren't visible to the public. That ambition and talent are constantly weighed against social savvy and personal resilience. That sometimes the hardest scenes to navigate aren't the ones written in the script. They're the ones written in the subtle interactions off camera. And that the courage to survive in this environment is as important as the courage to perform on set. But just when Patrick thought he had learned to navigate these complexities, to mask his discomfort and perform flawlessly, something happened that broke the rhythm entirely. Something that tested not just his acting skills, but his personal boundaries, his sense of self, and the very principles he thought would protect him. And that incident would be the one that changed everything, the one that he would carry silently for years, until the day he finally decided to speak out. What happened that day? How did it change Patrick's perspective on the set, on the industry, and on his own sense of boundaries? And why did he wait so long to reveal it? These questions lead us to the next chapter. A chapter that dives into the first uncomfortable encounter, the moment when the glamour mask slipped, and Patrick realized that on this set, reality was far more complicated than fiction. Have you ever been in a situation where the rules were unclear, where the line between what was acceptable and what wasn't seemed to shift depending on who was watching? For Patrick J. Adams, that line blurred early on the set of Suits, in a way that he never could have anticipated. You might think a television set is just a place to act, to deliver lines, to create entertainment. But sometimes, it's also a stage for personal power plays, subtle manipulations, and encounters that test the limits of your professional and personal boundaries. It started subtly. At first, it was small gestures, little comments that could be brushed off. A lingering touch on the arm during a casual conversation, a compliment that felt too intense, a playful joke that crossed the invisible line between friendly and invasive. Patrick tried to laugh it off, tried to rationalize it, telling himself that perhaps he was overthinking. After all, Hollywood is a place where charm is currency, flirtation is common, and people sometimes push boundaries in ways that feel uncomfortable but aren't necessarily malicious. But then, the incidents became more pointed, more deliberate. The timing, the setting, the words used, they all carried a weight that was unmistakable. One evening, after a long day of shooting, Patrick was asked to stay late to rehearse a particularly emotional scene. The set had mostly cleared out. The lights were dimmed. Only a few people remained. It was then that one of his co-stars, someone he had previously trusted as a friendly colleague, began to push beyond professional boundaries. Patrick remembers the moment vividly. The person moved closer under the pretext of giving direction, but the words carried an intensity that was personal, invasive, and unexpected. There was a pressure in the air, a sense that refusing or resisting could create tension, could make him seem difficult, uncooperative, or ungrateful. And in Hollywood, where reputations are fragile and opportunities fleeting, that can be a powerful form of manipulation. Patrick felt a mix of emotions. Confusion, anger, anxiety, disbelief. He wanted to assert his boundaries, to say no clearly and firmly. But the environment made that difficult. Cameras might have been off, but the unseen eyes of producers, directors, and crew still hovered metaphorically over him. One wrong move could be misconstrued, one reaction misinterpreted, one complaint dismissed or twisted. In that moment, Patrick realized that navigating this encounter wasn't just about personal comfort. It was about career survival. What makes this story particularly shocking is not only the action itself, but the subtle way it was carried out. There was no overt aggression, no dramatic scene meant to intimidate. Instead, it was calculated, masked by familiarity, and blended seamlessly into the professional context. It's the kind of behavior that leaves the victim doubting themselves, questioning whether their discomfort is valid, whether they are overreacting, or whether speaking up would make things worse. Patrick's instinct was to protect himself silently. He smiled, nodded, and attempted to redirect the conversation. He reminded himself that his focus was on the scene, on his lines, on his craft. He had to compartmentalize, separate his professional responsibilities from the personal invasion he was experiencing. But compartmentalization is exhausting, especially when the incidents repeat and when each encounter chips away at your confidence and sense of safety. After that evening, Patrick noticed a shift. His interactions with this co-star became a careful dance of avoidance, deflection, and professional politeness. He had to maintain the appearance of camaraderie, of normalcy, while internally grappling with a rising sense of violation. It's a situation many actors face but rarely speak about: the need to balance personal boundaries with professional expectations, the necessity of survival over confrontation. The tension didn't remain contained between just Patrick and this co-star. The dynamics began to ripple across the set. He noticed the way other actors interacted, how whispers circulated, how alliances subtly formed. Hollywood sets, even for shows as polished as Suits, are ecosystems of influence. A single uncomfortable encounter can become a catalyst for larger shifts in relationships, trust, and power. And Patrick found himself increasingly vigilant, analyzing every gesture, every comment, every glance, looking for hidden motives. The psychological toll was significant. Sleep became fitful, anxiety became a constant companion, and the line between professional and personal blurred further. Patrick recalls moments during filming when he had to pause, take deep breaths, and remind himself that he was there to act, to perform, to do his job. But acting under emotional strain is different. It's not just memorizing lines. It's navigating a minefield of personal tension, knowing that each interaction could have repercussions both seen and unseen. What makes Patrick's experience resonate, and what makes it relatable to so many, is that it's not just about Hollywood. It's about the complexity of human interactions and hierarchical systems. It's about power imbalances, about how ambition and authority can be used to manipulate and control, even in environments that appear glamorous and collaborative. And it's about the courage it takes to recognize when a line has been crossed, even when the system around you discourages acknowledgement. Patrick's first uncomfortable encounter set the stage for the ongoing tension that would define his early experience on Suits. Each subsequent incident, each repeated boundary push, reinforced the invisible rules of the set, that appearances mattered more than reality, that compliance was safer than confrontation, and that silence, though painful, could be a protective shield. Yet, with every repetition, the pressure mounted, and the emotional stakes grew higher. The complexity of the situation is compounded by the duality of performance. On set, Patrick had to deliver his lines flawlessly, embody his character convincingly, and maintain a polished on-camera persona. Off-camera, he had to navigate personal discomfort, evaluate threats to his professional reputation, and strategize every interaction. The mental load was immense, the stress unrelenting, and the emotional consequences profound. And yet, in the midst of this pressure, there were moments of fleeting relief. Moments when he could laugh, when the camaraderie felt genuine, when the work itself reminded him why he loved acting. These moments were rare, but they were crucial. They provided a sense of normalcy, a temporary reprieve from the psychological strain. But they also made the darker moments sting more acutely, highlighting the contrast between the polished exterior of the set and the messy reality of human interactions behind the scenes. Patrick's story in this chapter is a lesson in subtlety, in the slow erosion of personal boundaries, and in the courage required to navigate an environment where power dynamics are constantly shifting. It is a reminder that not all threats are overt, that not all violations are dramatic, and that sometimes the most damaging encounters are the ones that appear almost ordinary at first glance. And just when Patrick thought he had learned to navigate these subtle pressures, to manage the tension, and to compartmentalize effectively, an incident occurred that would push him further than ever before. It wasn't just another uncomfortable encounter. It was a direct challenge to his personal integrity, his sense of self, and his ability to maintain professional composure. What happened next would test him in ways he hadn't imagined. It would force him to confront the reality of the situation, to evaluate how far he would allow boundaries to be crossed, and to grapple with the question every actor fears: at what point does compliance become complicity? In that moment, the one that would redefine his experience on the set of Suits was just around the corner. But the details of that pivotal encounter, and the choices Patrick made in its wake, would remain unspoken for years until now. Have you ever been somewhere that looks like a dream on the surface but feels like a pressure cooker underneath? That's exactly what Patrick J. Adams experienced on the set of Suits. To the outside world, it was glitz, glamour, witty dialogue, and effortless charm. Cameras rolled, fans admired, and critics praised the cast's on-screen chemistry. But behind the perfectly framed shots and polished performances, the set was a hotbed of tension, hidden agendas, and unspoken rules. An environment that could crush an actor's confidence as easily as it could elevate a career. Patrick quickly realized that acting wasn't the hardest part of the job. The hardest part was navigating the social labyrinth of the set while managing his own emotional and personal boundaries. Every interaction carried weight. Every joke, comment, or glance could carry hidden meanings. Some were harmless. Others were subtle tests of loyalty, courage, or compliance. He had to read people constantly, decipher intentions, and choose his responses carefully. One misstep could lead to whispers, exclusion from key scenes, or worse, damage to his reputation before he even had a chance to prove himself. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of excitement and anxiety. Patrick threw himself into the work, perfecting his lines, studying his character, and trying to fit seamlessly into the ensemble. But the tension on set was palpable. There was a mix of admiration, rivalry, and cautious wariness among the cast. Everyone was ambitious, everyone wanted to shine, and yet everyone was also aware that their future could depend on how well they navigated the interpersonal minefield. It wasn't enough to be talented. You had to be socially savvy, politically astute, and emotionally resilient. Patrick's experience shows how the combination of fame, ambition, and secrecy can create a unique kind of pressure. He found himself constantly aware of the delicate balance between professional excellence and personal vulnerability. Some cast members thrived on the tension, using it to advance their own positions. Others quietly endured, suppressing feelings of discomfort or injustice in order to stay in the game. And then there were the moments when the pressure became almost unbearable, when the weight of expectation collided with the personal invasions he had begun to encounter. One day, Patrick was called into a scene that seemed simple on paper but was loaded with emotional complexity. The dialogue required him to channel vulnerability, anger, and wit all at once. But what made the scene particularly challenging wasn't just the acting, it was the off-camera tension. The same co-star who had previously crossed boundaries was present, creating an undercurrent of pressure that made every movement, glance, and word feel charged. Patrick had to deliver a flawless performance while simultaneously managing personal discomfort and evaluating the possible consequences of any misstep. The psychological toll of this duality is something most fans never consider. To perform convincingly on screen, Patrick had to embody his character's emotions, often amplifying them in ways that mirrored his real-life stress. Simultaneously, he had to contain his personal reactions, mask his unease, and navigate a set where every word could be scrutinized or misinterpreted. It's an exhausting mental balancing act, one that can leave even the most seasoned actors emotionally drained. As the season progressed, Patrick noticed patterns of manipulation and subtle power plays emerging across the cast and crew. Friendly gestures were sometimes strategic. Private conversations often carried hidden implications. Smiles could conceal ambition or resentment. He began documenting incidents in his mind, replaying conversations, analyzing gestures, and preparing for potential scenarios that could arise. It became a game of observation, survival, and self-protection, a constant mental workload that added another layer of stress to an already demanding job. Then came a turning point, a scene late at night, under dim lights, when only a skeleton crew remained. Patrick was asked to rehearse a particularly intense exchange. The co-star who had previously crossed boundaries approached him again, this time with a more insistent tone, suggesting that he push further emotionally for the scene in a way that Patrick found deeply uncomfortable. It wasn't just a suggestion for acting. It felt like a test, a subtle attempt to manipulate him into a space he wasn't willing to enter. Patrick's heart raced. He had to navigate this situation carefully. Rejecting the suggestion outright could escalate tension, but acquiescing would compromise his boundaries and self-respect. His mind raced through options. Should he confront the co-star? Should he retreat? Should he maintain the performance while internally resisting? Every choice carried risk, and the stakes felt enormous. This moment encapsulates the pressure cooker of the set. Ambition, fame, and secrecy combined to create an environment where personal discomfort collided with professional expectations. Patrick's experience highlights a crucial truth about Hollywood. Talent alone is rarely enough. Success depends on navigating social dynamics, protecting one's emotional integrity, and making strategic decisions in moments of high pressure. As the scene unfolded, Patrick managed to compartmentalize, focusing on delivering the performance while internally asserting boundaries. But the encounter left an indelible mark. He realized that his time on Suits would not just be defined by his acting, it would be defined by his resilience, his awareness, and his ability to manage the complex social and emotional dynamics around him. Yet, even as he navigated these challenges, Patrick was aware of the contradictions in his environment. On set, people celebrated camaraderie, collaboration, and professionalism. Off camera, the reality was more complex. Manipulation, boundary pushing, and strategic maneuvering coexisted with moments of genuine support and friendship. This duality created cognitive dissonance, forcing Patrick to constantly assess who he could trust, who had his back, and who might exploit a moment of vulnerability for personal gain. The stakes extended beyond the immediate environment of the set. Patrick's reputation, career trajectory, and public image were all intertwined with his ability to handle these pressures without faltering. In an industry where perception often outweighs reality, a single misstep could be magnified into a narrative that threatened to overshadow his accomplishments. And just when Patrick thought he had adapted to the pressure cooker, to the endless balancing act of ambition and self-preservation, an incident occurred that would push him further than ever before. A moment that would blur the lines between acting and personal violation and force him to confront the reality of his situation in a way he hadn't anticipated. What happened next would define his time on the show, challenge his sense of self, and set the stage for the events that he would eventually reveal publicly. It was a moment that combined high stakes, personal tension, and professional pressure in a way that would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about trust, ambition, and survival. Have you ever had a moment where everything you thought was safe, professional, and predictable suddenly shattered? For Patrick J. Adams, that moment came on the set of Suits in a way that would leave a permanent mark on his career, his perception of Hollywood, and his understanding of personal boundaries. This wasn't just another scene, another rehearsal, another day in a demanding environment. This was a moment that forced him beyond acting, beyond the script, beyond the camera, and into a space he wasn't prepared to navigate. It was late in the evening. The studio was mostly empty, the lights dimmed except for the soft glow illuminating the set. The crew had dwindled, leaving only essential personnel. Patrick had just finished a scene and was catching his breath when one of his co-stars, someone he had previously considered a friendly collaborator, approached him. At first, the approach seemed innocent, almost casual. But as soon as the conversation began, the tone shifted. The words weren't just about acting or the scene. They carried an intensity that was personal, invasive, and impossible to ignore. Patrick immediately felt the tension. It wasn't a sudden, explosive aggression. There was no yelling, no overt threat. It was subtler, more calculated, a pressure that seeped into the space around him, an insistence that he push further emotionally for the scene in ways that went beyond the script. It was manipulative, designed to test his boundaries, to see how far he would allow himself to be drawn into discomfort under the guise of professional expectation. In that moment, Patrick's instincts kicked in. He had to maintain composure while internally assessing the situation. Speaking out could have escalated tension, potentially impacting his role or creating conflict with producers and directors. Ignoring the pressure could have compromised his personal boundaries and sense of self. It was a delicate, high-stakes balancing act, and the weight of it pressed on him like a physical force. He tried to redirect the conversation, to bring the focus back to the scene. He smiled politely, used humor to deflect, and attempted to establish clear, professional boundaries. But the pressure didn't ease. The co-star leaned closer. The words became more insistent, the implication unmistakable. Patrick felt a surge of panic, followed by a determination to assert his own limits, to protect his integrity while still performing the role required of him. What makes this moment particularly shocking is not only the invasion of personal space, but the way it was intertwined with the professional demands of the job. The lines between acting and personal violation were blurred, and the very tools of the craft, emotional expression, vulnerability, authenticity, were being weaponized to pressure him into compliance. It's a tactic that is difficult to defend against, because refusing risks professional judgment, while acquiescing risks personal integrity. Patrick's mind raced. He recalled every rule, every principle he had learned about navigating professional spaces, about protecting personal boundaries. He reminded himself that no role, no scene, no opportunity justified a compromise of his dignity. And yet, the fear lingered. Fear of retaliation, fear of being labeled difficult, fear of losing control over the situation. In Hollywood, perception is often more powerful than reality, and Patrick knew that any misstep could have consequences beyond the immediate encounter. This pivotal moment was also psychologically intense. Patrick describes it as a collision of conflicting emotions, confusion, anger, anxiety, and disbelief mingled with a professional determination to complete the work. It's a type of stress that actors are rarely trained to handle. The pressure isn't just about performance, but about managing manipulation, maintaining boundaries, and protecting one's emotional well-being in an environment where personal and professional lines are deliberately blurred. And yet, amidst the tension, Patrick discovered a resilience he hadn't fully recognized in himself. He realized that setting boundaries wasn't just a personal necessity, it was an essential survival skill. He had to assert his limits, not with aggression, but with clarity, composure, and determination. He had to find a way to navigate the encounter that protected both his role and his self-respect. This encounter left Patrick shaken. It wasn't just about the specific words or actions. It was about the underlying power dynamics, the hidden pressures, and the subtle ways someone could push boundaries while hiding behind charm, professionalism, and the guise of collaboration. It illuminated the hidden culture of the set, a world where ambition, personality, and leverage intersected in ways that could exploit the vulnerabilities of even the most talented actors. Patrick also became acutely aware of the contradictions of his environment. On set, everything appeared polished, professional, and harmonious. Behind closed doors, the dynamics were far more complex. He realized that some of the smiles, the compliments, the gestures of camaraderie were tools of manipulation, designed to test limits and gauge responses. It was a delicate ecosystem of influence, ambition, and power, and navigating it required constant vigilance, emotional intelligence, and courage. After that night, the tone of Patrick's experience on Suits changed. He became more observant, more cautious, and more strategic in his interactions. He realized that boundaries weren't just personal, they were professional necessities. Every scene, every rehearsal, every casual conversation could carry layers of significance beyond the immediate context. He had to read situations carefully, assess risks, and determine how to respond in a way that maintained both his role and his integrity. This pivotal moment also reinforced a harsh truth about the entertainment industry, that talent and hard work, while essential, are not always enough. Success often depends on the ability to navigate social complexities, to assert personal boundaries under pressure, and to manage emotional stakes that are rarely acknowledged publicly. Patrick's experience is a stark reminder of the hidden costs of ambition, fame, and performance, and of the personal courage required to endure them. Yet, even as he developed strategies to cope, Patrick knew that this wasn't the end of the tension. The encounter had revealed vulnerabilities in the social ecosystem of the set, and it would inevitably have repercussions. The dynamics among cast and crew shifted subtly, the atmosphere became more charged, and Patrick's awareness of hidden agendas heightened. The incident left him more cautious, but also more determined to maintain control over his own choices and boundaries. And just when he thought he had navigated the immediate fallout, the ripple effects began. Relationships that once seemed friendly became complicated. Moments that had felt safe now carried an undertone of tension. Every smile, every interaction, every gesture had to be evaluated through the lens of the previous encounter. Patrick realized that the impact of this pivotal moment would extend far beyond a single scene or a single night. It would shape his entire experience on the show, influencing interactions, trust, and the perception of himself and others for years to come. This moment, the night that forced Patrick beyond acting, was the true test of his resilience. It was a collision of professional expectation and personal violation, of ambition and integrity, of opportunity and self-preservation. And it's a moment that he would carry silently, privately, until the courage to speak publicly came years later. Have you ever felt trapped in silence? Forced to endure something deeply uncomfortable, yet knowing that speaking out could cost you everything? For Patrick J. Adams, the aftermath of that pivotal night on the set of Suits wasn't just about managing personal boundaries. It was about navigating the crushing weight of secrecy. The encounter had left him shaken, conflicted, and hyper-aware of the intricate social web around him. Yet, in the world of Hollywood, silence often feels safer than confrontation. Patrick quickly realized that disclosing what had happened was not straightforward. The entertainment industry thrives on appearances. Productions are polished, reputations are carefully curated, and perception often outweighs reality. To reveal discomfort, to voice a boundary that had been crossed, risked being mischaracterized as difficult, uncooperative, or overly sensitive. In Hollywood, a single rumor or accusation can ripple across sets, casting offices, and networks, altering opportunities and perceptions in unpredictable ways. So Patrick endured in silence. He maintained a professional demeanor on set, smiling when expected, delivering lines with precision, and performing scenes with authenticity. Yet beneath the surface, the experience had left a lingering tension. Every interaction, every conversation, every glance carried an underlying awareness. The incident hadn't just happened. It had shifted the entire dynamic of the set for him. Trust became harder to extend. Casual interactions required constant analysis, and friendships felt simultaneously comforting and precarious. He found himself replaying the pivotal encounter in his mind repeatedly, analyzing every nuance, every word, every pause. Could he have done something differently? Should he have confronted the person immediately? Would speaking up have changed anything, or only worsened the situation? The questions were relentless, and with each day that passed, the silence began to feel heavier, a weight pressing on his chest that wasn't easily shaken. What makes Patrick's experience resonate is the universal struggle of balancing professional obligations with personal well-being. Many actors have encountered situations where boundaries are tested, where pressure extends beyond the script and into personal space. Yet few speak openly about it, partly because the stakes are so high, partly because the mechanisms of suppression are so subtle, and partly because survival requires adaptability. Patrick had to navigate this environment without losing himself, without allowing the incident to define him, and without sacrificing his integrity for the sake of appearances. At times, the psychological toll was immense. Patrick describes moments of anxiety, when stepping onto the set felt like stepping into a gauntlet. He would feel tension in his shoulders, a racing heartbeat, a knot in his stomach, physical manifestations of the stress he carried silently. But he also discovered a resilience he hadn't fully recognized before. The ability to compartmentalize, to continue performing despite emotional strain, became a critical skill. He had to separate the demands of his role from the complexities of human interaction, ensuring that his craft was not compromised even as his emotional boundaries were tested. Maintaining this silence also required constant vigilance. Patrick became hyper-aware of microexpressions, subtle shifts in tone, and underlying motives in conversations. He monitored not just what was said, but what was implied, who was observing, and how actions could be interpreted. Every decision had weight. Every response was calculated, and while some might call this strategic, it came at a personal cost. Constant mental exertion, persistent emotional tension, and the slow erosion of the carefree enthusiasm he had brought to the set initially. Adding to the challenge was the internal conflict between ambition and personal integrity. Patrick loved acting. He valued the creative process, the challenge of embodying a character, the joy of connecting with a story. Yet he couldn't ignore the intrusion he had experienced, nor could he reconcile it easily with his professional obligations. Each day, he faced the tension of wanting to succeed and wanting to protect himself, a balancing act that left him emotionally exhausted and acutely aware of the fragility of professional relationships in Hollywood. Patrick also noticed how silence could become a double-edged sword. By not speaking out, he avoided immediate conflict, but the experience lingered in his mind, coloring his perception of interactions, influencing decisions, and shaping his understanding of trust and loyalty. It was a silent burden, one that few outside the industry could truly grasp. Yet, paradoxically, it was this silence that preserved his position, allowed him to continue working, and gave him the space to process the experience before revealing it publicly years later. Throughout this period, Patrick learned the subtle art of negotiation without confrontation. He found ways to assert boundaries indirectly, to navigate interactions tactfully, and to maintain professionalism without sacrificing self-respect. This required constant awareness, emotional intelligence, and strategic thinking. It also demanded courage, because even when no one else knew, he had to acknowledge the reality of the experience and protect his sense of self in an environment that often prioritized compliance over personal well-being. The isolation of silent suffering also had emotional consequences. Patrick felt a deep tension between his private awareness and public performance. Moments that should have been joyful, laughing with co-stars, celebrating milestones, or enjoying creative breakthroughs, were tinged with the residual anxiety of knowing what had occurred and having to maintain composure. Yet, within this tension, he also developed a remarkable capacity for empathy, resilience, and self-awareness. He learned to recognize subtle forms of manipulation, to navigate difficult personalities, and to cultivate emotional strength in ways few actors are ever required to. At the same time, the silent suffering highlighted the complexities of trust and friendship on set. Patrick realized that not every friendly gesture was genuine, and not every confident smile indicated authenticity. He became attuned to hidden agendas, subtle power plays, and unspoken social rules. This heightened awareness was a survival mechanism, a way to protect himself from further discomfort, and a lens through which he began to interpret his surroundings more cautiously. Yet even with all this vigilance, Patrick found moments of solace in his craft. Acting became not just a job, but a refuge, a space where he could channel his emotions, explore human complexity, and express authenticity within the boundaries of a character. These moments reminded him of why he chose the profession and provided a temporary reprieve from the pressures and manipulations that had become part of his daily life. But the silent suffering also posed an ongoing dilemma. How long could he endure without breaking? How much could he absorb before it affected his performance, his relationships, or his sense of self? And perhaps most importantly, when would the courage to speak out finally outweigh the fear of professional repercussions? Have you ever felt surrounded by people, yet utterly alone? That was the world Patrick J. Adams entered as he navigated the set of Suits after the pivotal encounter that had pushed him beyond acting. In Hollywood, friendships and alliances are as fragile as they are essential. On one hand, allies can provide support, protection, and guidance. On the other, betrayals can strike subtly, hidden beneath smiles, jokes, or seemingly innocuous comments. For Patrick, discerning who was truly on his side became as critical as mastering his lines. At first, he believed in the camaraderie of the cast. There were moments of laughter during rehearsals, shared stories between scenes, and the occasional quiet word of encouragement. Some cast members seemed genuinely supportive, offering advice, sharing insights, or simply listening without judgment. These small acts became lifelines, reminders that he wasn't entirely alone. Patrick learned quickly to treasure these rare gestures of authenticity. They were like islands of calm in a sea of tension. But Hollywood is rarely that simple. Every interaction carried a hidden layer, every compliment a potential ulterior motive, every gesture a possible manipulation. Patrick began noticing subtle betrayals that others might have dismissed. A co-star who laughed at a private joke behind his back, but subtly undermined him in meetings. A producer who seemed friendly on set but whispered criticisms in the ears of others. The same people who smiled in daylight could sow uncertainty and tension after hours. In this environment, loyalty was measured not by words but by actions, and actions often had consequences far beyond their apparent intent. Patrick's ability to read the room became essential. He observed microexpressions, tone shifts, and subtle changes in behavior that signaled hidden agendas. He learned to weigh every conversation, to understand who had influence over casting, scene decisions, or public perception. The delicate dance of alliances and betrayals was exhausting, yet he knew it was vital for his survival and for maintaining his professional trajectory. In Hollywood, misjudging a relationship could cost you a role, a reputation, or the trust of those who mattered most. One of the most shocking aspects of this chapter of Patrick's life was the realization that betrayal could come from unexpected places. People he considered friends occasionally aligned with those who had crossed boundaries, sometimes offering subtle justifications, other times remaining silent. Patrick understood that silence in these cases often meant complicity. It was protection for themselves, or a strategic choice to avoid conflict. The lesson was stark. In Hollywood, self-interest often outweighs loyalty, and trust must be earned, constantly reassessed, and never taken for granted. Amid the tension, Patrick also discovered the complex dynamics of allies. Some were protective, offering subtle interventions, advice on how to navigate scenes, or guidance on maintaining professional integrity without jeopardizing opportunities. These allies weren't always obvious. They could be a supporting actor who deflected uncomfortable situations, a crew member who discreetly provided information, or even a director who subtly ensured a scene played out safely. Recognizing these individuals required careful observation and intuition, skills that Patrick honed over time. The interplay of alliances and betrayals created a unique psychological landscape. Patrick had to balance trust and skepticism, openness and caution. Every gesture of kindness could carry hidden motives, and every confrontation had to be carefully managed. The emotional stakes were high, and the constant vigilance required was mentally exhausting. Yet, it was also a profound education in human behavior, strategy, and resilience. Patrick learned to read situations quickly, anticipate potential conflicts, and choose his responses with precision. The consequences of misjudged alliances were immediate and sometimes subtle. A misplaced word could be interpreted as disloyalty. A private conversation could be twisted into rumor. Even the perception of weakness could be weaponized by those seeking leverage. Patrick realized that survival required not just talent, but social intelligence, careful observation, and emotional fortitude. Each decision, each interaction, carried layers of meaning that could influence his career and personal safety. Yet, for all the betrayals, there were moments of genuine support. Allies provided reassurance, shared coping strategies, and even helped Patrick assert boundaries without public conflict. These moments reinforced the importance of discernment. While betrayal was ever present, there were individuals whose loyalty was real, whose intentions were protective rather than manipulative. Patrick began to rely on these relationships strategically, understanding that alliances were as crucial to survival as performance skills. But Hollywood's pressures aren't static. As Patrick navigated this landscape, he found that betrayal could come in waves, often tied to moments of heightened tension, competition for roles, or the perception of weakness. One small incident could trigger a cascade of whispers, subtle interventions, or attempts to undermine confidence. Patrick learned to anticipate these dynamics, to prepare for potential challenges, and to respond in ways that maintained his professionalism and emotional equilibrium. The emotional weight of this chapter cannot be overstated. Patrick felt the loneliness of being surrounded by people who were not fully allies, the anxiety of navigating hidden agendas, and the constant need to protect himself in a high-stakes environment. Yet he also experienced moments of clarity, when genuine support reminded him of his values, his resilience, and his capacity to persevere. These moments were fleeting, but they were powerful, proof that even in a world filled with manipulation and betrayal, authenticity could exist. As Patrick's understanding of alliances and betrayals deepened, he began to see the larger patterns of the set. Individuals who appeared supportive could shift depending on circumstances, alliances could form and dissolve quickly, and personal advantage often drove behavior more than camaraderie. Navigating this ecosystem required constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and an acute sense of social intelligence. Every interaction was a test, every conversation a potential minefield, and every choice a determinant of future opportunities. Yet, even as he learned to navigate these complex dynamics, Patrick faced another challenge: maintaining his own integrity while dealing with those who sought to exploit him. It was one thing to read people and anticipate their moves. It was another to respond in a way that protected him emotionally and professionally. The balance between assertiveness and diplomacy, between personal safety and career ambition, became a defining skill of his time on the show. And just when Patrick thought he had identified the boundaries of loyalty and betrayal, the environment threw another curveball. A trusted ally, someone he had come to rely on for guidance and support, revealed intentions that were surprising, contradictory, and potentially threatening. This twist forced Patrick to reassess his strategy, his perceptions of trust, and his approach to interpersonal dynamics on set. It was a stark reminder that Hollywood relationships are fluid, complex, and often unpredictable. The experience of allies and betrayals left Patrick both wary and wise. He developed a keen sense of discernment, an ability to read hidden motivations, and the emotional resilience to continue performing despite personal discomfort. Yet it also reinforced the isolation that comes from being acutely aware of the social chessboard around you, a loneliness tempered only by moments of genuine connection and the private satisfaction of maintaining personal integrity. And just when Patrick thought he could rely on the insights he had gained, an incident occurred that would challenge every lesson he had learned about trust, loyalty, and self-preservation. It was a moment that would force him to confront betrayal in its most direct form, to test his boundaries, and to navigate consequences that extended far beyond personal discomfort. Have you ever reached a breaking point? That moment when the pressure, the manipulation, and the silent suffering build to a point where compliance is no longer an option? For Patrick J. Adams, the turning point on the set of Suits was precisely that. A moment where survival, ambition, and integrity collided, forcing him to make a choice that would change the trajectory of his experience forever. Up to this point, Patrick had navigated the complexities of Hollywood with caution. He had endured boundary-crossing behavior, maintained a professional demeanor despite personal discomfort, and observed alliances and betrayals with careful attention. He had learned to compartmentalize, to manage interactions strategically, and to suppress the fear and anxiety that came with silent suffering. But the cumulative weight of these experiences reached a threshold, one that demanded action. The turning point didn't happen in a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet, tension-filled day during the shooting of a critical scene. The same co-star who had previously tested his boundaries was present, and the subtle manipulations began again. Instructions for pushing further emotionally were given in a tone that carried implicit pressure. Patrick recognized that acquiescing would compromise his integrity, and yet resisting could be construed as difficult or uncooperative. It was a high-stakes scenario where every decision mattered. Patrick recalls the mix of emotions he felt in that moment: anger, fear, determination, and clarity. He realized that his silence, his attempts to manage the discomfort privately, had allowed the behavior to continue. If he wanted to protect himself and assert control over his experience, he needed to act decisively, but tactfully. Standing up didn't mean confrontation in the traditional sense. It meant asserting boundaries, reclaiming personal agency, and communicating his limits clearly and firmly. He took a deep breath, grounded himself, and addressed the situation directly but professionally. Using a calm tone, he stated his boundaries, emphasizing that personal pressure had no place in his professional environment. It was a delicate balance. He needed to maintain composure while making it clear that the behavior was unacceptable. Patrick knew that words alone might not immediately change the dynamic, but they were an essential first step in reclaiming control over his environment and self-respect. The response was mixed. Some on set nodded quietly, acknowledging the professionalism and courage required to assert boundaries. Others, particularly the co-star in question, reacted with subtle tension, adjusting behavior but not fully relinquishing control. Patrick realized that standing up was not a single moment, but an ongoing process. Boundaries would need to be reinforced, interactions carefully managed, and vigilance maintained. The turning point was not a victory. It was the beginning of active self-advocacy. This experience forced Patrick to reassess not only the immediate situation, but also the broader context of his career and personal values. Hollywood is a place where ambition often comes with pressure, where compliance can be rewarded and resistance can be punished. Yet Patrick understood that personal integrity, emotional safety, and self-respect could not be sacrificed for the sake of convenience or career advancement. The turning point was as much internal as it was external, a recognition that his agency and dignity mattered more than temporary comfort or approval. Standing up for himself also had ripple effects across the set. Others began to recognize the importance of boundaries, seeing firsthand that assertiveness could coexist with professionalism. The dynamic shifted subtly, creating space for more respectful interactions and reducing the implicit pressures that had been tolerated.